Tom Fox, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 82 of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. In this episode, I take a look at the continued fallout from the GSK case and how that will impact your management of third-party risk going forward. This is Tom Fox, and I would like to welcome you to this episode of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. In this episode, I want to talk about a couple of things that have recently come up in the anti-corruption and anti-bribery world that I think are going to have some pretty long-term impacts on how companies do compliance, meaning how do they actually put together compliance programs, policies, and procedures to actually do compliance. And I want to start with an offshoot of the GlaxoSmithKline case, GSK in China. As many of you know, I've written and talked extensively on GSK, and I really think it's going to be a game changer across the globe and anti-corruption because it was really the first time we'd seen the Chinese government enforce domestic anti-corruption laws against Western corporations. In the year plus since GSK scandal was originally announced, we've seen the Chinese move against a wider range of Western companies on a wider variety of issues, including price fixing, monopoly, other antitrust issues. It's expanded beyond the healthcare, pharmaceutical, medical device industry to automotive, tech, and other industries. So obviously that's going to be something that we need to watch carefully and see how it might impact Western companies. But today I'd like to talk about the recent trial of Peter Humphreys and his Chinese wife, Ms. Wu. They were arrested for obtaining illegally personal information on Chinese nationals as an offshoot of the GSK scandal. I say an offshoot of the scandal because they were not hired as part of the official internal investigation that GSK engaged in after it was notified by an anonymous whistleblower of allegations of bribery and corruption in the China business unit. No, they were hired because the GSK country manager had a surreptitious video recording made of he and his girlfriend together having sex. And this tape, this GSK sex tape, was emailed to various GSK board members and senior management who viewed this as a very serious invasion of privacy. And so they hired Mr. Humphrey and Ms. Wu to see if they could find out a couple of things. One, how the tape got made, and two, who was behind making it. It turned out that a camera had been planted in the China unit's apartment in Beijing or Shanghai. And then what they could not determine, though, was who actually sent who actually sent a copy of the sex tape. So during the course of this investigation, and apparently they were not told about any of the allegations of bribery and corruption against the GSK's China business unit. They were not told that GSK had an ongoing corruption investigation proceeding along a parallel track. Sometime I think this tape was sent to GSK in April of 2013, and sometime back then in June they reported back that they were really unable to determine who had either made the tape and then who had sent it to GSK anonymously. In July of 2013, they were both arrested, and in August of this year, they were tried in a one-day trial in a Shanghai court. And in this trial, they both pled guilty, and they both read statements that they were not aware that they had they were not aware that they had broken the law in obtaining certain personal information on Chinese nationals. Mr. Humphreys was sentenced to 3 years in jail. His wife sentenced to 2 years in jail. Mr. Humphreys will be deported at the end of his sentence. Ms. Wu is a naturalized U.S. citizen, but originally a Chinese citizen, and apparently she'll be allowed to stay in the country if she so desires. But I want to use that as a jumping off point to talk about some of the issues that I think it raises going forward in a best practices compliance program. One of the things that I think you should have, obviously, when you relate to third parties, is a 5-step process. And I've talked extensively about that 5-step process in the management of third parties. But to kind of summarize, it's you need to have a business justification and a business sponsor internal to your company. You need to provide a questionnaire to the third party. Based upon that questionnaire and your analysis of the risk, you need to perform a specified level of due diligence on that party. Thereafter, you need to evaluate that due diligence, and if you decide to move forward, put together a contract with compliance terms and conditions with your regular commercial terms. And then step 5 is the management of that commercial relationship with that third party going forward. Oversight, management, auditing, all of the things that you would do once the contract is signed. And where I think the Humphreys trial speaks to in that process is in steps 2 and 3, the questionnaire and then the due diligence. One of the key reasons you perform due diligence is certainly the questionnaire is an important part of any effective compliance program. And as the DOJ has made clear, if a company refuses to answer questions in the business questionnaire in this process, that it's someone you need to take a very hard look at doing business with going forward. Nevertheless, it's not just trust the answers you get, but you need to verify, to use the old Ronald Reagan phrase, trust but verify. And due diligence, performing of due diligence is part of that verification process. It is also there to help you determine any ultimate beneficial owners who have not been identified, politically exposed persons, those sorts of wide-ranging investigations that you need to do to make sure the information you've been given is correct. In many countries, if you think about here in the United States, a lot of that information is publicly available through an online database search, information on who's a governmental official, information if they've been sued previously, if they've been arrested or charged with a crime involving fraud or corruption. Some of that information is available in countries outside the United States, depending on the sophistication of their internal infrastructure, internal IT infrastructures. If that information is on a database that you can get to, it may be on a selected database that you need really in-country resources to do a database search, such as ownership information of corporations, corporate charters, applications and licenses to do business, etc. So one level of due diligence is an online database search that anyone can do. You can do it, I can do it, we can go on Google and do it. A second level of due diligence, level 2 due diligence, is generally recognized as an in-country database search, and you may need to retain a company that can perform that database search for you in a local language and then have that translated. And then the level 3 due diligence is generally recognized as boots on the ground investigation going forward. And there you physically review documents, review news stories, interview witnesses, take a look at the physical facilities of your third party, do a lot of different things that require sort of eyes on site type of investigation. And where the Humphreys case may impact that is your ability to get information on who you're doing business with, the verify part of the trust but verify. So the question becomes, if you are in China or if you are in Africa or if you're in any other geographic location where the information is restricted by law, what can you do to manage that risk or manage that relationship going forward? And that's where really the 5 steps need to be thought of in a holistic approach, although I've specified what they consist of. Because if you can't do this verification, you need to put additional risk management tools and techniques around some of the other steps, so that you would have as complete a file as you can have, understanding that you may not be able to do all of the things that you previously thought you could do in terms of background due diligence and research. So one of the things that obviously comes up is after step 3 is step 4, which is your evaluation and your compliance terms and condition, and then your management of the relationship going forward. So what can you do? What steps can you take? How can you put an additional risk management tool around this issue going forward? Well, one of the things you can do is to have a more robust review of the invoices and information that are provided to you by the third party. So instead of reviewing on a semi-regular basis, quarterly, 6 months, or annually, testing only certain invoices, maybe you should look at those invoices on a regular basis as they come in on a monthly basis. What should you look for? You should look at the description of the services provided to make sure that they have adequately described any services they provided. You should make sure that any requests for payment are within the parameters of what you've agreed to under the contract. And then other steps you can engage in are training of third parties, making sure that they understand what their obligations are as a third-party agent to you, a company subject to the US FCPA, UK Bribery Act, or other anti-corruption legislation. And then you can actually visit them. Site visits, I think, are an important risk management technique or tool that is not regularly thought about or not regularly used. And by a site visit, I don't mean that necessarily someone in the compliance home office here in America gets up and flies over to China to visit a particular agent. But certainly if you have a compliance representative in Asia Pacific or APAC, perhaps you could have them visit certain selected agents every month, just to remind them how important it is to your company that they do business in compliance with the FCPA, how important it is to the business relationship that you have with them that they do business in compliance within the FCPA, to take a look at the documents at a more granular level than perhaps you've done in the past. You could do this with, like I said, if you have a regional compliance representative, perhaps your business unit president, or perhaps even your regional vice president could do a businessman to businessman meeting and discussion with each of your third parties around compliance going forward, and just that ongoing discussion about the need to have compliance be embedded within the framework and indeed DNA of the third party, because of your obligations, is something that I think is an important message to send to a third party. But once again, it shows that even if you can't do the full due diligence in terms of personal information that you thought was possible before, there are other risk management techniques and tools. At any time you do something, if you've ever heard me speak, my mantra on the three most important things on FCPA compliance are document, document, document. Anything you do regarding a third party should be documented. So if there are site visits, physical facility visits in a due diligence, those obviously need to be documented to show what turned up as a result of that background investigation. But going forward after the contract has been signed, do you have a report form? Every time you have an interaction with that third party, is there a report made? The training that's given, do you have a copy of that training made? Do you have a certificate showing who attended the training? If you ran any tests or other inquiry at the end of the training to see if they understood it or in any way got it, how do you show and demonstrate through your documentation that you've taken these extra risk management steps and tools and techniques? Of course, you should have the right to audit, because that should be in your compliance terms and conditions, and that should be a right you have going forward. And you may need to ramp up or move up or increase your audit schedule in a way that you had not been able to or had not anticipated before, rather, once again, because of the fallout of the GSK matter and the Humphreys convictions. What is one thing that many companies don't really focus, I think, perhaps enough on is what is the compensation rate? What is it based on? Are you dealing with a commission rate only? Are you dealing with an hourly plus some commission? What's the range of your compensation rate? If you're in one country, do you have a standard compensation rate? If you have a 5% compensation rate, I think that's probably going to pass muster. But if you have a $1 billion contract, 5% compensation rate for an agent may be too high, and you may have a cascading scale down based upon the gross value of the contract that would be executed with the end using customer or your ultimate customer. And how has that compensation rate been evaluated internally by yourself? So, do you have a range? What's the legitimate justification for that range? Bill Athanas, colleague of mine and compliance practitioner who now practices law in Birmingham, came up with a kind of a three-pronged approach for evaluating and endorsing compensation rates with a distributor model. And Bill really laid it out, and I'm going to just read from what he's written, a justification for 3 steps. But I think more than it's much broader and is more useful in the distributor context. So step 1, you need to obtain relevant information about the contemplated commission rate. That information needs to be documented. As Bill says, captured and memorialized. And I would say document, document, document. So what is relevant information? Are there any market studies? What are your competitors doing? What are you doing with other third-party agents? Second, if there's a request for an increase in the commission rate, it should be evaluated in a streamlined fashion. But you need to have tiers of levels of approval within your company so that if you go outside of a range that you previously established as the compliance chief compliance officer, compliance practitioner, or even compliance committee, you need to put a second set of eyes on it. What's the reason for an increase in your commission rate? If you'll think back to the Eli Lilly FCPA enforcement action of December 2012, where one of the problems Lilly got into was in Brazil, where they had given a distributor a compensation rate which was outside, and their distributor, he received a discount of the products. They had a typical discount rate for distributors of 6 to 12%. And they gave one distributor a discount amount of 17%. And there was really no business justification for that. But more importantly, and to Bill's second point, there was no second set of eyes or critical analysis by a different group within compliance to understand why this discount rate had been given. And of course, the end of the story was the discount rate led to a increased amount of money that was available to fund a pot for payment of bribes. So you need to put a second set of eyes on by a higher level committee approval if you're going outside your standard range. And then Bill ends with any increased commissions or discount rates are then tracked along with a request authorization to facilitate auditing, testing, and benchmarking. What Bill has laid out for us in this 3-step process is a well thought out protocol which you need to follow and document through your entire process. But if you kind of tie it back into GSK and the Peter Humphreys and his wife Ms. Wu's trial, if you can't engage in the due diligence, excuse me, that you previously thought you could, and you're concerned that the information you receive in the business questionnaire, you may not know who the full beneficial owners, and it turns out that there's government ownership, foreign government official ownership in the third party that you're doing business with, obviously that's a problem. But if you manage it on the back end so that the commission rate, the discount rate, whatever the payment is to this third party is in a reasonable rate, reasonable within the context of your individual business with a third party, it's reasonable in the context of the industry that you're working in that geographic area, and then you manage that, look at it, and audit it all on the back end, that may give you the ability to move forward even without the information that you previously thought you could get through the due diligence process. All of this is just trying to emphasize a way to think about risk. And the 5-step life cycle management of third parties process that I continually talk about, where I lay out those 5 steps on how I think you should manage your third party relationships. If it turns out that you can't utilize one of those in a manner that you had intended on, so that your risk increased because one step is not as robust, perhaps you could increase your risk management in some of the other steps. And that's why managing the relationship going forward may become more important to you and more paramount in your overall program and it allows you to move forward and once again have evidence, because it all turns on what are you going to do when a regulator or investigator comes knocking. How are you going to show that you've identified the risk as best you can, and then you've managed those risks going forward. So third parties are generally recognized as the greatest risk under the FCPA. I think 95 to 98% of all FCPA enforcement actions generally revolve around third parties. So these are pretty well known risks. It's something the Department of Justice and SEC will continue to take a look at, and it's all very important that you incorporate these concerns into your third-party risk management program going forward. I've written several blog posts on this issue. If you have any questions, I'm happy to provide you additional information, or I can send you these individual blog posts. You can reach me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. This is Tom Fox, and I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report.